The automatic doors of St. Mary's Medical Center slid open with a soft whoosh as Catherine Morrison stepped into the humid Indiana evening. The late September air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant rain, and she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. At 34, Catherine had always been the type of woman who noticed details, the way shadows fell across parking lots, the sound of her heels on wet pavement, the feeling that someone might be watching. Tonight, those instincts felt sharper than usual. She had just finished her shift as a night nurse in the pediatric ward, the same job she'd held for 8 years since graduating from nursing school. The hospital corridors still echoed in her mind, the soft beeping of monitors, the whispered conversations of worried parents, the gentle hum of fluorescent lights that never quite went dark. Catherine loved her work, but lately the weight of caring for sick children had begun to press heavier on her heart, especially since her own daughter Emma had started kindergarten just 3 weeks ago. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now let's continue with Catherine's story. The parking lot stretched before her like a sea of yellow sodium lights reflecting off rain-slicked asphalt. Catherine's 1992 Honda Civic sat in her usual spot near the emergency room entrance, close enough to the building that she felt safe walking alone at night, but far enough from the ambulance bay to avoid the constant noise. She fished her keys from her purse, the small silver bracelet on her wrist catching the light. The bracelet had been a gift from her mother, a simple chain with a small, heart-shaped charm engraved with CM and the date of Emma's birth, March 15th, 1991. As she unlocked her car door, Catherine noticed a piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. Her stomach tightened. In the 6 months since her divorce from David had been finalized, she'd grown increasingly paranoid about his attempts to contact her. The restraining order was still in effect, but David Morrison had never been good at following rules, especially when he'd been drinking. The note was handwritten in block letters on a torn piece of notebook paper. Emma needs you to come home right now. Emergency. No signature, no explanation. Catherine's hands trembled as she read it again under the parking lot lights. Her babysitter, Mrs. Henderson, would have called the hospital if there was a real emergency. She would never send a cryptic note. But what if something had happened to Mrs. Henderson? What if Emma was hurt and couldn't reach a phone? Catherine's rational mind told her to call home first, but her mother's instincts overrode logic. She threw her purse into the passenger seat and started the engine, her heart hammering against her ribs. The drive from the hospital to her small rental house on Maple Street usually took 15 minutes, but tonight she made it in 10, running 2 yellow lights and taking corners faster than she should have. The familiar neighborhoods of her small Indiana town blurred past her windows. The corner grocery store where she bought Emma's favorite cereal, the park where they fed ducks on Sunday afternoons, the elementary school where Emma had just started making friends. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, which made the growing dread in Catherine's chest feel even more surreal. The house looked normal from the outside, porch light on, Mrs. Henderson's Buick still parked in the driveway. But something felt wrong. The living room window, which usually glowed with the warm light of the table lamps, was dark. Catherine parked behind Mrs. Henderson's car and hurried up the front walk, her keys ready before she reached the door. The October night was unusually warm for Indiana, but she felt cold all over, as if ice water had replaced the blood in her veins. "Mrs. Henderson," she called as she stepped inside. "Emma?" Silence greeted her, thick and oppressive. The house felt different, not just quiet, but empty in a way that made Catherine's skin crawl. She flipped on the lights and called again, louder this time. No answer. The living room looked exactly as she'd left it that morning. Emma's colouring book stacked neatly on the coffee table, the throw pillows arranged on the couch, Mrs. Henderson's knitting basket beside her usual chair. But the television was off, which was strange. Mrs. Henderson always watched her evening programs while Emma played. Catherine climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her nursing shoes silent on the carpeted steps. Emma's bedroom door was closed, which was unusual. Mrs. Henderson always left it open when Emma was sleeping. Catherine turned the handle slowly, almost afraid of what she might find. The room was empty. The bed was made, the stuffed animals arranged, just as Emma had left them that morning. Catherine checked the closet under the bed, even behind the curtains, though she knew it was pointless. Emma wasn't here. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She ran back downstairs and searched the entire house, the kitchen, the basement, the small backyard, with its swing set and sandbox. She called Mrs. Henderson's house and got no answer. She called her own mother in Michigan, waking her from sleep, but her mother hadn't heard from anyone. Catherine even called David's apartment, despite the restraining order, but the phone rang endlessly with no answer. With each unanswered call, the reality of the situation became more terrifying. Emma and Mrs. Henderson had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. By midnight, Catherine had called the police, who treated her report with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for divorced mothers and custody disputes. Officer Bradley, a thick-set man with tired eyes and coffee stains on his uniform, took notes while sitting at Catherine's kitchen table. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows across his weathered face as he asked the same questions over and over, as if repetition might reveal some detail Catherine was hiding. "And you're sure your ex-husband doesn't have the child?" he asked for the 3rd time, his pen hovering over his notepad. "David doesn't have custody rights," Catherine said, struggling to keep her voice level. The words felt foreign in her mouth, as if she were speaking a language she'd only recently learned. The restraining order specifically prohibits him from being alone with Emma, and Mrs. Henderson would never let him take her. She knows about his drinking, about the violence. Something happened to them. Officer Bradley shifted in his chair, making it creak under his weight. "Mrs. Henderson's car is still here, but she's not. I've been calling her house all night. No answer. She always answers her phone. Always." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling that had started in her hands and was now spreading through her entire body. The house felt too big around her, too empty, as if the walls had expanded to accommodate a vastness she couldn't comprehend. Officer Bradley closed his notebook with a snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "Look, Mrs. Morrison, in 90% of these cases, it's a misunderstanding. Maybe Mrs. Henderson had a family emergency and took the little girl with her. Maybe your ex-husband picked them up and they're at a movie or something. Kids lose track of time. We'll file a report, but I'd suggest you wait until morning before you panic." But Catherine was already beyond panic. She had entered a realm of terror so pure and complete that panic seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. She spent the rest of the night sitting by the phone, calling Mrs. Henderson's number every 20 minutes. The automated voice that told her the number was not in service became as familiar as a lullaby, though it brought no comfort. When dawn broke grey and drizzly over Indiana, painting the kitchen windows with watery light, she was still wearing her nursing scrubs from the night before, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking from too much coffee and too little hope. At 7 a.m., she drove to Mrs. Henderson's house on Oak Street, 3 blocks away through the quiet residential neighborhood where American flags hung limply from front porches and morning newspapers lay in plastic bags on driveways. The elderly woman's house looked normal from the outside, a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, but something was wrong. Newspapers were piled on the front porch, 3 days' worth at least, and mail overflowed from the mailbox. Mrs. Henderson was meticulous about these things. She collected her mail and newspaper every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, as regular as clockwork. Catherine knocked until her knuckles were raw, the sound echoing through the quiet morning air. A neighbor across the street peered through her curtains, then quickly looked away when Catherine waved. Using the spare key Mrs. Henderson had given her for emergencies, Catherine let herself into the house that smelled of lavender and old furniture polish. The house was empty, but not in the way Catherine's house had been empty. This felt different, as if Mrs. Henderson had left in a hurry, interrupted in the middle of her evening routine. The television was still on, tuned to the morning news, where a cheerful weatherman was predicting rain for the weekend. A cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, cold but only half finished, with a faint ring of lipstick on the rim. Mrs. Henderson's purse was gone, but her reading glasses were still on the coffee table beside an open romance novel, a bookmark placed carefully at chapter 12. Catherine stood in the middle of Mrs. Henderson's living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life interrupted, and felt something inside her break. Not her heart. That had been breaking all night. Something deeper, more fundamental. Her understanding of how the world worked, her belief that bad things happened to other people, her faith that love and caution could protect the people she cared about. All of it crumbled like paper in rain, leaving her standing in a stranger's house with nothing but questions and a fear so vast it seemed to have its own weather system. When she called the police station again, she reached Detective Sarah Walsh, a woman in her 40s with intelligent brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Detective Walsh listened carefully to Catherine's story, taking detailed notes and asking the kinds of questions that suggested she was taking the disappearance seriously. Unlike Officer Bradley, she didn't dismiss Catherine's concerns or suggest she wait for the situation to resolve itself. "We'll put out an alert for Mrs. Henderson's vehicle," Detective Walsh said, her voice calm and professional. "Silver 1989 Buick LeSabre. Do you have the license plate number?" Catherine provided the information, along with detailed descriptions of both Emma and Mrs. Henderson. Emma, 5 years old, 42 pounds, blonde hair usually worn in pigtails secured with red rubber bands, wearing a red sweater with small white flowers and blue jeans when Catherine left for work. A gap between her 2 front teeth that made her lisp slightly when she said words with S sounds. A small scar on her left knee from falling off her bicycle the previous summer. Mrs. Henderson, 73 years old, grey hair permed into tight curls every Friday at Marilyn's beauty salon, wearing a purple cardigan and black slacks, probably carrying her black leather purse with the broken clasp that she refused to replace because it had been a gift from her late husband. "We'll also need to talk to your ex-husband," Detective Walsh said gently, her pen poised over her notepad. Catherine provided David's address and workplace information, though she explained about the restraining order and his history of drinking. Detective Walsh made notes about everything, including the strange note that had been left on Catherine's car. The note itself had been blown away by the wind sometime during the night. Catherine had left it on the kitchen counter and found only empty space when she looked for it in the morning. But she had memorized every word, every letter, the way trauma burns certain details into memory while erasing others completely. The investigation began in earnest that afternoon, with the efficiency of a small-town police department that rarely dealt with serious crimes. Detective Walsh and her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, interviewed Catherine's co-workers at the hospital, confirming that she had indeed worked her entire shift and left at her usual time. The head nurse, Margaret Chen, told detectives that Catherine had seemed normal during her shift, tired perhaps, but not distressed or worried about anything at home. "Catherine is one of our most reliable nurses," Margaret explained. "She's never missed a shift, never left early. The children adore her. If she says something's wrong, then something's wrong. They questioned Catherine's neighbors, canvassing the entire block with the thoroughness of investigators who understood that in small towns people notice things, but no one had seen anything unusual. The house next door to Catherine's was occupied by an elderly couple, Harold and Mildred Peterson, who went to bed at 9 o'clock every night and wouldn't have noticed if a marching band had paraded through the neighborhood. The house across the street was empty. The previous tenants had moved out the week before, leaving behind only pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung and the faint smell of moving boxes and goodbye tears. David Morrison became the immediate focus of the investigation, though finding him proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. When detectives arrived at his apartment complex, a run-down collection of two-story buildings on the outskirts of town, they found his unit empty and his landlord claiming he hadn't seen David in several days. The landlord, a heavy-set man named Chuck, who smelled of cigarettes and motor oil, seemed genuinely surprised by the police presence. "Dave's been a good tenant," Chuck said, jingling his keys nervously. "Quiet, pays his rent on time, doesn't cause trouble. But now that you mention it, I haven't seen his truck around lately." David's supervisor at the auto parts warehouse where he worked confirmed that he hadn't shown up for his shift in 3 days and hadn't called in sick. This was unusual behavior for David, who, despite his personal problems, had always been reliable at work. His co-workers described him as quiet and withdrawn, someone who kept to himself but did his job competently. But several of them mentioned that he had seemed increasingly agitated in recent weeks, taking longer lunch breaks and making personal phone calls during work hours. "He was always talking about his kid," said Tommy Rodriguez, a co-worker who had shared cigarette breaks with David behind the loading dock. "How much he missed her, how unfair the divorce was. He seemed to think his ex-wife was trying to turn the little girl against him, but he never seemed violent or anything. Just sad, you know, like a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him." David's car, a 1988 Chevrolet pickup truck, red with rust spots around the wheel wells and a cracked windshield, was nowhere to be found. Detective Walsh put out a statewide alert for the vehicle, including neighboring states in case David had decided to run. The truck was distinctive enough that someone should notice it, especially if it was traveling with passengers who might be in distress. Detective Walsh obtained a warrant to search David's apartment, a process that took longer than usual because the judge wanted to review the evidence carefully before authorizing entry into a private residence. What they found when they finally gained access painted a troubling picture of a man whose grip on reality had been deteriorating for months. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, a studio with a kitchenette, a fold-out couch that served as both seating and bed, and a card table that functioned as both dining room and desk. But it was the walls that told the real story. Dozens of photographs covered every available surface, creating a shrine-like atmosphere that made Detective Walsh's skin crawl. Most were pictures of Emma and Catherine, but these weren't the normal family photos of a divorced father. These appeared to have been taken without their knowledge, from a distance, with a telephoto lens. The photos showed Emma and Catherine at the grocery store, at Emma's school, in their own backyard. There were pictures of Catherine leaving the hospital after her shifts, pictures of Emma playing on the playground at school, pictures of both of them through the windows of their house. Some of the photos had been taken at night, which suggested that David had been conducting surveillance for weeks, or even months. "He's been stalking them," Detective Rodriguez observed, carefully photographing each image before bagging it as evidence. But there was no sign of Emma or Mrs. Henderson in David's apartment, and no obvious clues about where he might have taken them. The bathroom medicine cabinet contained only basic toiletries and a prescription bottle for antidepressants that hadn't been refilled in over 2 months. The refrigerator held beer, cold cuts, and little else. The closet contained work clothes and a few personal items, but nothing that suggested David had been planning a trip or preparing to go into hiding. The apartment manager provided security footage from the building's parking lot, but the camera only showed the entrance to the complex, not individual units. The footage confirmed that David's truck had not been parked in his assigned spot for at least 4 days, which meant he had been gone since before Emma and Mrs. Henderson disappeared. This timeline troubled Detective Walsh. If David wasn't living at his apartment, where had he been staying? And how had he managed to coordinate the kidnapping if he wasn't even in town? As the first week passed with no leads, the search expanded beyond the immediate area. Mrs. Henderson's Buick was found on the 3rd day, abandoned in the parking lot of a shopping center 15 miles from her house. The Eastgate Mall was a sprawling complex of stores and restaurants that served several small towns in the area, busy enough that an abandoned car might go unnoticed for days. The car was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, Mrs. Henderson's purse on the passenger seat with her wallet intact. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Her credit cards, driver's license, and $63 in cash were all still there. But the car itself told a story that made Detective Walsh's blood run cold. The driver's seat had been adjusted for someone much taller than Mrs. Henderson, and there were muddy footprints on the floor mats that didn't match the sensible walking shoes Mrs. Henderson always wore. Security cameras at the shopping center showed the Buick arriving at approximately 11:30 p.m. on the night of the disappearance, about 2 hours after Catherine had found her empty house. The image quality was poor, typical of mid-1990s surveillance technology, but it clearly showed a single figure getting out of the car and walking away. The person appeared to be a man of average height and build, but the darkness and grainy footage made identification impossible. Whoever drove the car here knew what they were doing, Detective Walsh told Catherine during one of their daily briefings. They parked under a light that was burned out, walked directly away from the cameras, and disappeared into the surrounding neighborhood. This wasn't random. It was planned. The discovery of the abandoned car transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something much more sinister. Detective Walsh contacted the FBI, requesting assistance with what now appeared to be a kidnapping that had crossed state lines. Special Agent Maria Santos arrived from Indianapolis 2 days later, bringing with her resources and expertise that the local police department couldn't match. Agent Santos was a woman in her 30s with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of whatever she was looking at. She had worked dozens of kidnapping cases, and she brought a methodical approach that both impressed and terrified Catherine. This was no longer about a missing child and elderly woman. This was about predators and victims, about criminal minds and federal crimes, about a world Catherine had never imagined she would need to understand. Catherine threw herself into the search with desperate energy, fueled by a combination of hope, terror, and caffeine that kept her functioning on 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night. She took leave from her job at the hospital, a decision that was both financially devastating and emotionally necessary. She couldn't focus on caring for other people's children when her own daughter was missing. She couldn't comfort worried parents when she was living every parent's worst nightmare. Her mother, Eleanor, drove down from Michigan the day after the Buick was found. Eleanor Morrison was a retired schoolteacher in her 60s, a practical woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband, but nothing had prepared her for this. She found Catherine in a state of controlled hysteria, functioning but barely, sustained by nothing more than willpower and the refusal to consider that Emma might already be dead. "You need to eat," Eleanor said, finding Catherine in the kitchen at 6 a.m., surrounded by coffee cups and phone logs. "You need to sleep. You need to take care of yourself so you can take care of Emma when she comes home." Catherine's sister Laura flew in from Oregon, taking vacation time from her job as a software engineer to help with the search efforts. Laura was younger than Catherine, unmarried, and had always been the organized one in the family. She turned Catherine's living room into a command center, with maps of the tri-state area pinned to the walls, phone logs tracking every lead and tip, and a filing system that would have impressed a military intelligence operation. The three women worked 18-hour days, coordinating with police, following up on tips, and managing the overwhelming community response to Emma's disappearance. The story had been picked up by regional television stations and newspapers, and the response was both heartening and exhausting. Tips poured in from across the Midwest, sightings of David's truck, reports of a man traveling with a woman and child, theories about where they might be hiding. But every lead ended in disappointment. The red pickup truck spotted in Illinois turned out to belong to a plumber. The man with a child, seen at a rest stop in Ohio, was a divorced father legitimately traveling with his daughter. The suspicious activity reported at a campground in Kentucky was just a family trying to have a quiet vacation away from the media attention surrounding their own recent tragedy. The community response was overwhelming in ways Catherine had never expected. Parents from Emma's elementary school organized search parties that combed through nearby parks and wooded areas. The local Walmart donated supplies for the search efforts, water bottles, flashlights, two-way radios, and hundreds of copies of Emma's photograph. Churches throughout the county added Emma and Mrs. Henderson to their prayer lists, and several organized special services where congregations prayed specifically for their safe return. Catherine found herself the reluctant center of this attention, doing interviews with local television stations and radio shows, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She learned to speak in sound bites, to compress her agony into 30-second segments that might air on the evening news. She learned to hold herself together in front of cameras while falling apart the moment the lights went off. "Please," she said during one particularly difficult interview, staring directly into the camera lens, as if she could reach through it to wherever Emma might be watching. "If you have my daughter, if you know where she is, please bring her home. She's just a little girl. She needs her medicine for her asthma. She gets scared in the dark. Please don't hurt her. Please bring her home to me." Indeed, the investigation revealed troubling details about David Morrison's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Agent Santos conducted interviews with everyone who had known David, creating a psychological profile of a man whose mental health had been deteriorating for months. His co-workers at the auto parts warehouse reported that he had been drinking heavily and talking obsessively about his ex-wife and daughter. His behavior had become increasingly erratic, showing up late for work, taking long lunch breaks, making personal phone calls during business hours. His supervisor, Ray Martinez, told Agent Santos that David had been asking strange questions about whether it was possible to disappear completely and start a new life somewhere else. He seemed to think if he could get his family back, everything would be okay, Martinez explained. But the way he talked about it, like Catherine and Emma belonged to him, like they were his property, it gave me the creeps. "I probably should have said something to someone, but you don't think these things will actually happen." Phone records revealed the extent of David's obsession. In the weeks before the restraining order was filed, he had been calling Catherine's house repeatedly, sometimes as many as 20 times per day. When she stopped answering, he began calling the hospital where she worked, though he never spoke to her directly. The pattern suggested an escalating fixation that had been building for months, possibly since the divorce was finalized. Agent Santos also interviewed David's family members, a process that revealed a history of violent behavior that predated his marriage to Catherine. His own mother, Patricia Morrison, spoke reluctantly to federal agents, admitting details about her son that she had kept hidden for years. David had been abusive toward previous girlfriends, she revealed, and had spent 6 months in jail for assault when he was 22 years old. David always had trouble with anger, Patricia told Agent Santos during a difficult interview in her modest apartment across town. When he drank, he became a different person entirely. Mean, controlling, violent. But I never thought he would hurt Emma. She's his own daughter. He loved her so much when she was born. I thought having a child would change him, make him better. But love and violence often existed side by side in men like David, Agent Santos knew. The same possessiveness that made him adore his daughter also made him capable of destroying her rather than letting her go. It was a psychology she had encountered before, always with tragic results. The search for David's truck became a national effort when the case was featured on several television crime shows. America's Most Wanted ran a segment about the disappearance, complete with dramatizations and appeals for viewer tips. The show generated hundreds of phone calls from across the country, sightings of the truck in truck stops and campgrounds, reports of a man matching David's description traveling with a woman and child, theories from amateur detectives who thought they had solved the case. But every lead ended in disappointment. The truck spotted at a rest area in Tennessee belonged to a construction worker. The man with a child seen at a motel in Arkansas was a grandfather taking his grandson to visit relatives. The suspicious activity reported at a cabin in rural Missouri turned out to be a family of legitimate vacationers who happened to match the general description of the missing persons. Detective Walsh worked the case with a dedication that went beyond professional duty. She had children of her own, 2 daughters, ages 8 and 12, and Emma's disappearance had struck her with personal force. She found herself thinking about the case during off-duty hours, waking up in the middle of the night with new theories and leads to pursue. Her husband worried that she was becoming too emotionally invested, but Walsh knew that sometimes emotional investment was exactly what a case needed. 6 months after the disappearance, Detective Walsh was forced to acknowledge what everyone involved in the investigation already knew, but had been reluctant to admit. The case had gone cold. The initial burst of tips and sightings had dwindled to nothing. David's truck had vanished as completely as if it had been swallowed by the earth. Despite a nationwide search, no trace of Emma, Mrs. Henderson, or David Morrison had been found. "We're not giving up," Detective Walsh assured Catherine during what had become their weekly meetings. "Cold cases can break open years later when someone comes forward with information they didn't think was important at the time. Sometimes it's a deathbed confession, sometimes it's someone who finally decides to do the right thing. We'll keep the case active, and we'll pursue any new leads that develop." But Catherine could see the resignation in Detective Walsh's eyes, could hear the subtle shift in her voice from active investigation to long-term hope. The police department had other cases now, other emergencies that demanded immediate attention. Emma and Mrs. Henderson were becoming statistics, names in files that would be reviewed periodically, but no longer actively pursued. Catherine refused to accept that reality. She used her savings to hire Jerry Coleman, a private investigator who specialized in missing persons cases. Coleman was expensive, more than Catherine could afford on her nursing salary, but her mother mortgaged her house in Michigan to pay for his services. Eleanor Morrison had lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier, and she wasn't about to lose her granddaughter to bureaucratic resignation. Coleman was a former police detective in his 50s, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, who had seen enough tragedy to be realistic about outcomes while still maintaining hope for solutions. He brought fresh eyes to the investigation, re-examining evidence that police might have overlooked and developing new theories about what might have happened to the missing persons. His working hypothesis differed significantly from the police theory. While investigators had focused on David as a lone wolf, acting out of desperation and mental illness, Coleman believed the kidnapping had been carefully planned with the assistance of unknown accomplices. "This wasn't a spontaneous crime," Coleman told Catherine during one of their regular meetings in his small office above a downtown insurance agency. The note on your car, the timing of Mrs. Henderson's departure, the way they disappeared without a trace, it all suggests careful planning. David had help, or he had resources we don't know about. Coleman's investigation uncovered new information about David's activities in the months before the disappearance. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals from David's checking account, totaling nearly $8,000 over 6 weeks. This was far more money than David should have had access to. His salary at the auto parts warehouse was modest, and he had been paying child support and alimony to Catherine. Where did the money come from? Coleman wondered aloud. And what did he spend it on? $8,000 in cash doesn't just disappear. Coleman also discovered that David had been researching remote areas in other states based on library computer records showing searches for information about rural Montana, northern Minnesota, and the forests of northern Maine. The computer logs showed that David had printed maps and camping information, suggesting he had been planning to take someone to a location far from Indiana. He was looking for places to hide, Coleman concluded. Somewhere isolated, where a man could live off the grid with a woman and child. The question is whether he was planning a new life or planning something much darker. Even Coleman's thorough investigation failed to produce the breakthrough Catherine desperately needed. After spending nearly $20,000 of her mother's money, he was forced to admit that the trail had gone completely cold. David Morrison, Emma and Mrs. Henderson had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the kind of grief that never fully heals. Catherine eventually returned to work at the hospital, though she was never the same person who had walked out of St. Mary's Medical Center on that September night in 1996. Her colleagues noticed that she had become quieter, more withdrawn, older in ways that couldn't be measured in years. She moved through her shifts like a ghost, providing excellent care for her young patients, but never quite seeming fully present. Her laughter, when it came at all, sounded hollow. Her personal life ceased to exist. She had no energy for friends, no interest in dating, no hobbies or activities beyond the basic requirements of survival. Her purpose had been reduced to a single point of focus, the hope that someday, somehow, Emma would come home. She kept Emma's room exactly as it had been on the night of the disappearance. The bed made with the pink comforter, the stuffed animals arranged on the pillow, the coloring books stacked on the small desk. Years passed with the slow weight of accumulated sorrow. Detective Walsh retired after 25 years of service, and the case was transferred to younger detectives who reviewed it periodically but had no new leads to pursue. Catherine moved to a different house. She couldn't bear to live in the place where Emma had been taken, but she kept her phone number the same, just in case Emma ever tried to call home. She participated in vigils and awareness events for missing children, though each one reopened wounds that never quite healed. She learned to speak about her loss in public forums, sharing Emma's story with other parents and advocating for better protection of children from domestic violence. But every speech, every interview, every public appearance was both a tribute to Emma's memory and a reminder of Catherine's failure to protect her daughter. By 2010, 14 years after the disappearance, Catherine had begun the slow process of accepting that she might never know what happened to Emma. She was 48 years old, her hair prematurely grey, her face marked by years of grief and stress. She had learned to function in the world, even to find small moments of peace in her work at the hospital, but the hope that had sustained her for so long was beginning to fade into something more like resignation. The breakthrough came on a cold Tuesday morning in November 2024. 28 years after Emma and Mrs. Henderson had vanished from Catherine's life. Catherine was at work in the pediatric ward, adjusting the IV line for a 7-year-old boy recovering from appendix surgery, when her phone rang. The caller identified himself as Detective James Park with the Indiana State Police. "Mrs. Morrison, we found something that might be related to your daughter's case," Detective Park said carefully, his voice neutral in the way of professionals who have learned not to raise hopes too quickly. "Could you come to the station this afternoon? I'd rather discuss this in person." Catherine's hands shook as she hung up the phone. In all the years since the disappearance, she had received dozens of similar calls, potential sightings, possible evidence, leads that always led nowhere. She had learned not to get her hopes up, to approach each new development with the emotional armor she had built through years of disappointment. But something in Detective Park's voice suggested this was different, more substantial than the usual dead-end tips. She arranged coverage for her remaining patients and drove to the police station through the grey November afternoon, her mind cycling through possibilities. Had they found David's truck? Had someone finally come forward with information? Had Emma, now 33 years old, somehow made contact? The drive took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. At the police station, Detective Park led Catherine into a small conference room where several evidence bags were laid out on a metal table under harsh fluorescent lights. Detective Park was a man in his 30s, younger than Catherine's own daughter would have been, with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who understood the weight of the moment. In the largest evidence bag was a silver bracelet, tarnished black with age and dirt, but unmistakably familiar. Catherine's heart stopped as she recognized the small heart-shaped charm engraved with CM and Emma's birth date. This was the bracelet she had been wearing the night Emma disappeared, the last gift her mother had given her before she died of cancer in 1995. "We found this 3 days ago," Detective Park explained, his voice gentle. Construction workers were clearing land for a new housing development about 40 miles north of here, near the town of Brookville. They uncovered what appears to be the remains of an old campsite, buried under years of fallen leaves and debris. Catherine stared at the bracelet through the clear plastic of the evidence bag, afraid to touch it, afraid to believe it was real. After 28 years of uncertainty, of wondering and hoping and imagining, here was physical proof that something terrible had happened. The bracelet represented both an end and a beginning, the end of not knowing and the beginning of a truth she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. "What else did you find?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the small room. Detective Park opened another evidence bag, revealing fragments of clothing that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. There was a piece of purple fabric that could have come from Mrs. Henderson's favorite cardigan and a small red button that matched the sweater Emma had been wearing on the night she disappeared. There were other items too. The corroded remains of camping equipment, empty food containers that had been buried for decades, and most chilling of all, several pieces of rope cut into short lengths and partially preserved by the acidic soil. "The site appears to have been used as a temporary camp," Detective Park continued, consulting his notes. "Our forensics team is still processing everything, but the evidence suggests that someone lived there for several weeks, possibly months. We've also found what appear to be 3 separate burial sites in the immediate area." Catherine felt the room spinning around her, the fluorescent lights seeming to pulse with a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. After 28 years of not knowing, of imagining every possible scenario, from rescue to escape to new lives in distant places, the truth was finally emerging. But it wasn't the truth she had hoped for during all those sleepless nights and empty birthdays. DNA testing took 2 weeks to complete, 2 weeks during which Catherine existed in a state of suspended animation between hope and despair. She took another leave of absence from the hospital, unable to focus on anything except the phone call that would either confirm her worst fears or somehow, miraculously, prove that the evidence belonged to someone else. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, while Catherine was sitting in her kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. Detective Park's voice was gentle but definitive. The remains found at the campsite included those of Mrs. Henderson and Emma, along with a third set of remains that belonged to David Morrison. After 28 years of uncertainty, the case was finally closed. The forensics investigation painted a grim picture of what had happened in the weeks following the disappearance. Based on the evidence recovered from the campsite, investigators concluded that David had indeed planned the kidnapping carefully, preparing the remote location in advance and stockpiling supplies for an extended stay. The campsite was located on abandoned land that had once been part of a larger farm, hidden deep in dense woods that were rarely visited by hunters or hikers. The location was nearly invisible from any road or trail, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that had been blocked off for decades. David had apparently scouted the area extensively, creating a crude shelter and hiding place where he believed he could keep Emma and Mrs. Henderson indefinitely. The evidence suggested he had been preparing for months, slowly accumulating camping equipment, non-perishable food, and other supplies necessary for survival in the wilderness. David had apparently forced Mrs. Henderson to write the note that lured Catherine away from the hospital, using the elderly woman and Emma as leverage to ensure Catherine's compliance with whatever plan he had developed. The three of them had been held at the campsite for an undetermined period, forensic evidence suggested at least several weeks, before something went tragically wrong. The condition and arrangement of the remains suggested that David's mental state had deteriorated rapidly in the isolation of the campsite. Empty alcohol containers found buried at the site indicated that he had continued drinking heavily, and the forensic evidence pointed to a violent confrontation that had ended with all three victims dead and David taking his own life. Detective Park handled the investigation with sensitivity, understanding that every detail was both an answer Catherine had been seeking for decades and a fresh wound that reopened all her grief. Emma had been 5 years old when she died, still believing in fairy tales and happy endings. Mrs. Henderson had been an innocent victim who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by a man whose rage had consumed everything good in his life. The discovery brought a strange kind of closure to Catherine's life, though closure felt like the wrong word for something so devastating. For 28 years, she had lived with uncertainty, never knowing whether Emma was alive somewhere, whether she should keep hoping, whether she should try to move on with her life. The not knowing had been its own special torture, but it had also allowed room for hope, for imagination, for the possibility that someday Emma would walk through the door as a grown woman with children of her own. Now Catherine knew the truth, as painful as it was. Emma had died as a child, had never grown up, had never had the chance to become the teacher she had always said she wanted to be. Mrs. Henderson had died trying to protect a little girl who wasn't even her own granddaughter. And David, the man Catherine had once loved, had married, had trusted with their daughter, had destroyed everything she cared about, and then destroyed himself. The funeral for Emma and Mrs. Henderson was held on a grey December day, with snow threatening but never quite falling. The church was packed with people Catherine barely recognized, former classmates, co-workers from over the years, neighbors from houses she had lived in decades ago. The community had never forgotten Emma Morrison, and they had never stopped hoping she would come home safely. Catherine spoke briefly at the service, her voice steady despite the tears that had been falling almost continuously for weeks. She talked about Emma's love of coloring books and her dream of becoming a teacher. She talked about Mrs. Henderson's kindness, her willingness to care for a child who wasn't her own. She thanked everyone who had searched, who had prayed, who had kept Emma's memory alive during the long years of uncertainty. Emma would have been 33 years old now, Catherine said, looking out at the sea of faces in the packed church. She might have had children of her own. She might have become that teacher she always said she wanted to be. We'll never know what she might have accomplished, what lives she might have touched, what joy she might have brought to the world. but we can remember the joy she brought to our lives in her 5 short years. Detective Walsh, now retired and in her 70s, attended the funeral and approached Catherine afterward. The two women embraced, united by their shared commitment to finding the truth and their mutual understanding of what it meant to carry hope for so many years. "I never stopped thinking about this case," Detective Walsh said, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry it took so long to find them. I'm sorry the ending wasn't what we all hoped for." Catherine nodded, understanding that some questions could only be answered with time and sometimes with luck. The construction workers who had found the campsite could have easily missed the burial sites, could have cleared the land without ever disturbing the remains. In that sense, Catherine felt grateful that Emma and Mrs. Henderson had finally been found, that they could finally rest in peace after so many years in the wilderness. In the months that followed the funeral, Catherine began the slow process of rebuilding her life around this new reality. She was 62 years old, approaching retirement, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, she could think about the future without the constant weight of uncertainty. The grief remained, would always remain, but it was different now. It was the clean grief of loss, rather than the complicated grief of not knowing. She established a scholarship fund in Emma's name, providing financial assistance for young women studying education at the local community college. The first recipient was a 19-year-old named Sarah, who wanted to teach kindergarten, and Catherine attended her graduation 2 years later with tears of both sadness and pride. Catherine also began volunteering with organizations that supported families of missing persons, offering comfort and practical advice to parents who were experiencing the same nightmare she had lived through for so many years. She learned that her story could be both a source of hope, because families needed to keep believing, and a source of strength, because even the worst possible outcome could be survived. The silver bracelet was eventually returned to Catherine after the forensic investigation was completed. She had it professionally cleaned and repaired, replacing the broken clasp and polishing the tarnish from the silver links. She wore it every day now, not as a reminder of loss, but as a connection to the daughter she would always love and to the mother who had given it to her so many years ago. Catherine still worked at the hospital, still cared for children in the pediatric ward, though she was planning to retire within the year. But now, when she looked at the young patients and their worried parents, she saw them with different eyes. She understood the preciousness of every moment, the fragility of the bonds that hold families together, and the strength that people could find even in the darkest circumstances. She had learned that love persists beyond loss, that hope could survive even when it wasn't rewarded, and that the human capacity for healing was deeper than she had ever imagined. Emma was gone, but she was no longer lost. Mrs. Henderson's sacrifice had not been forgotten, and Catherine herself had survived something that had once seemed unsurvivable. The case of Emma Morrison and Dorothy Henderson was officially closed, but their story continued to resonate in the community and beyond. It served as a reminder of the importance of protecting vulnerable women and children, of taking domestic violence seriously, and of never giving up hope, even when hope seemed impossible to maintain. For Catherine, the end of the mystery marked not an ending, but a new beginning. She could finally grieve properly, could finally say goodbye, and could finally begin to heal from wounds that had been open for 28 years. Emma would always be her 5-year-old daughter, frozen in time with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. But Emma would also be the inspiration for every scholarship recipient, every child Catherine helped at the hospital, every family she counseled through their own dark nights of uncertainty. Sometimes Catherine reflected as she prepared for retirement and the next phase of her life, knowing the truth, even a terrible truth, was better than not knowing anything at all. Emma was home now, at peace, no longer lost in the wilderness, And that, after 28 years of searching, was enough.